Welcome to Storytime with Mrs. Cole. Today we're continuing our adventures with the adventures of Peter Cottontail. What's going to happen today? Here we go. Chapter 16. Reddy Fox Tells a Wrong Story. Reddy Fox was a sight. There was no doubt about that. When he started down on to the Green Meadows that morning, he limped like an old man. Yes, indeed, Reddy Fox was a sorry-looking sight. His head was swelled so that one eye was closed and he could hardly see out of the other. Reddy never would have ventured out, but he just had to have some fresh mud from the Smiling Pool. Reddy had waited until most of the little meadow people were out of the way. Then he had tried to hurry so as to get back as quickly as possible. But Johnny Chuck's sharp eyes had spied Reddy, and Johnny had guessed right away what the trouble was. He hurried over to tell Peter Rabbit. Then the two little scallywags hunted up Jimmy Skunk and Bobby Coon to tell them, and the four hid near the lone little path to wait for Reddy's return. Pretty soon Reddy came limping along. Even Johnny Chuck was surprised at the way Reddy's face had swelled. It was plastered all over with mud, and he was a sorry sight indeed. Bobby Coon appeared very much astonished to see Reddy in such condition, though of course Johnny Chuck had told them all how Reddy had run headfirst into the home of old Mrs. Hornet and her family the day before. Bobby stepped out in the lone little path. "Why, Reddy Fox, what has happened to you?" he exclaimed. Reddy didn't see the others in the long grass. He didn't want Bobby Coon to know that he had been so careless as to run headlong into a hornet's nest, so he told a wrong story. He put on a long face. That is, it was as long as he could make it, considering how swollen it was. "I've had a most terrible accident, Bobby Coon," Reddy said, sighing pitifully. "Oh, it happened yesterday as I was running an errand over beyond the hill. Just as I was coming through the deepest part of the woods, I heard someone crying. Of course, I stopped to find out what the matter was." "Of course," interrupted Bobby Coon. "Certainly, to be sure, of course." Reddy looked at him suspiciously, but went on with his tale. "Right down in the thickest, blackest place, I found one of Uncle Billy Possum's children being worried to death by Digger the Badger. I couldn't see that little possum hurt." "Of course not," broke in Billy Coon. "So I jumped in, tackled old man Badger, and I had him almost whipped. Then I slipped over the edge of the big rock on the side hill. It took the skin off my face and bruised something terrible. I don't care as long as I save that little old possum child," concluded Reddy as he started on. Johnny Chuck stole up behind him and thrust a sharp briar into the seat of Reddy's pants. Just at the same time, Johnny made a noise like a whole family of hornets. Reddy Fox forgot his limp. He never even turned his head to look behind. Instead, he started off at his best speed, and it wasn't until he heard the roar of laughter behind him that he realized that he had been fooled again. Chapter 17. Reddy Almost Gets Peter Rabbit. Reddy Fox was really almost ill from the effects of the stings which old Mrs. Hornet and her family had given him when he knocked in the side of their house. For several days he limped around, his head badly swollen. Yes, sir, Reddy Fox was in dreadful bad way. The worst of it was that none other than the little meadow and the forest people seemed to be the least bit sorry for him. Some of them actually laughed at him. Peter Rabbit did. Reddy Fox had made life very uncomfortable for Peter for a long time, and now Peter was actually enjoying Reddy's discomfort. Now, while he was laid up this way, Reddy had plenty of time to think. He noticed that when he went out for a walk, all those who kept at a safe distance when he was now well, now hardly got out of his way. They knew that he felt too sore and mean to try and catch them. Peter Rabbit hardly turned out of his path. A bright idea came to Reddy. He would continue to appear badly even after he was well. He would keep his head bound up and would limp down to the Smiling Pool for mud every day. Then, when Peter Rabbit came near enough, Reddy would catch him. So day after day, Reddy limped down to the Smiling Pool. He kept his head tied up as if it was bad as ever, and as he walked, he groaned as if in great pain. Even some of those who hated him most began to feel sorry for Reddy Fox. Peter Rabbit has a very soft heart, and although he knew that Reddy Fox would like nothing better than to gobble him up, he began to feel sorry for Reddy. One morning Peter sat just outside the old briar patch when Reddy came limping along. He looked more miserable than usual. Just as it had been for several days, one of Reddy's eyes was closed. "It must be hard to work to see with only one eye," said Peter Rabbit. "It is," replied Reddy with a great sigh. "It's very hard work indeed." "I don't see how you manage to get enough to eat," continued Peter in the most sympathetic voice. Reddy sighed again. "I don't, Peter Rabbit. I don't get enough to eat, and I'm nearly starved this very minute." When he had said this in such a tone of longing crept into his voice that Peter instantly grew suspicious. While he was sorry for Reddy, he had no desire to make Reddy feel better by furnishing himself for a meal. Peter hopped around to the blind side of Reddy and turned his back to him, as if he inquired for the health of old Granny Fox. Now you know that Peter's eyes are so placed in his head that he can see behind him without turning his head. Reddy Fox did not know this, or if he did, he had forgotten it. Very slowly and craftily, the closed eye opened a wee bit, and in that little line of yellow was a hungry look. Peter Rabbit saw it, and with a great jump landed behind the friendly bramble bush in the old briar patch. "Ha ha!" shouted Peter. "I'd rather talk with you, Reddy Fox, when you haven't got a closed eye with such a hungry look in it. Ta-ta!" Reddy Fox just shook his fist at Peter Rabbit and started off for home, pulling the badge from behind his head as he went. Chapter 18. Johnny Chuck Prepares for Winter. There was something in the air that Peter Rabbit couldn't understand. It made him feel frisky and happy and ready to run and race, or have a frolic with anyone who might happen along. He couldn't understand why it didn't make all his other friends and neighbors in the Green Meadow and in the Green Forest feel the same way. But it didn't. No, sir, it didn't. Some of those whom he liked best to play with wouldn't play at all, not even for a few minutes. They said they hadn't time. Peter was puzzling over it as he scampered down to the lone little path, kicking his heels and trying to jump over his own shadow. Ahead of him, sitting on his own doorstep, was Johnny Chuck. "My goodness, how fat Johnny Chuck is getting," thought Peter Rabbit, and then he shouted, "Come on and play hide and seek, Johnny Chuck." But Johnny Chuck shook his head. "Can't," he said. "I've got to get ready for winter." Peter Rabbit sat down and looked at Johnny Chuck curiously. He couldn't understand why anybody would take thought and trouble to get ready for winter. He didn't, except that he put on a warmer coat. So he couldn't imagine why Johnny Chuck would have to get ready for winter. "Well, how do you do it?" he asked. "Do what?" Johnny Chuck looked up in surprise. "Why, get ready for winter, of course," Peter Rabbit replied, just a wee bit impatiently. Johnny Chuck looked at Peter as if he thought Peter was very stupid indeed. "Why, I eat, of course," he said shortly, and began stuffing himself as if he hadn't anything to eat for a week, when all the time he was so fat and roly-poly that he could hardly waddle. Peter's eyes twinkled. "I should think you did," he explained. "I wouldn't mind getting ready for winter that way myself." You know, Peter thinks a great deal of his stomach, and then he added, "I should think you were trying to eat enough to last you all winter." Johnny Chuck yawned sleepily, and then once more began to eat. "I am," he said briefly, talking with his mouth full. "What's that?" cried Peter Rabbit, his eyes popping out. "I said I'm trying to eat enough to last me all winter. That's the way I get ready for winter," replied Johnny Chuck a wee bit crossly. "I think I've got enough now," he added. "How cool it is getting. I think I'll go down and go to sleep. I'll see you in the spring, Peter Rabbit." "What? What's that?" exclaimed Peter Rabbit, looking as if he hadn't heard him all right. But Johnny Chuck had disappeared inside his house. Chapter 19. Peter Rabbit Gets Another Surprise. Peter Rabbit sat on Johnny Chuck's doorstep for 5 long minutes, scratching his head first with one hand and then the other. "Now, what did Johnny Chuck mean by saying that he would see me in the spring?" said Peter Rabbit to himself. "Here it isn't even winter yet, and it will be a long, long time before it's spring, yet Johnny Chuck spoke as if he didn't expect to see me until winter had passed. Is he going away somewhere? If he isn't, why won't I see him all winter, just as I have all summer?" The more Peter thought about it, the more puzzled he became. At last he had a happy thought. "I'll just run down to the Smiling Pool and I'll ask Grandfather Frog. He is very old and very wise, and he will surely know what Johnny Chuck meant." So kicking up his heels, Peter Rabbit started down the Lone Little Path, lippity-lippity-lip, across the green meadows to the Smiling Pool. There he found Grandfather Frog sitting as usual in his big lily pad pond. But the lily pad wasn't as green as it used to be, and Grandfather Frog didn't look as smart as usual. His big googly eyes looked heavy and dull, just as if they hadn't seen much of anything at all. Grandfather Frog nodded sleepily and once nearly fell off the big lily pad. "Good morning, Grandfather Frog," shouted Peter Rabbit. "Oh, what?" said Grandfather Frog, blinking his eyes and putting one hand behind his ear as if he was hard of hearing. "I said, good morning, Grandfather Frog," shouted Peter Rabbit a little louder than before. "No," replied Grandfather Frog grumbly. "It isn't a good morning. It's too chilly." He shivered as he spoke. Peter Rabbit pretended not to notice how grumpy Grandfather Frog was. In his most polite way, he asked, "Can you tell me, Grandfather Frog, where Johnny Chuck spends the winter?" "Spends it at home, of course. Don't bother me with such foolish questions," snapped Grandfather Frog. "But if he's going to spend the winter at home, what did he mean by saying that he wouldn't see me in the spring, just as if he expected not to see me before then?" persisted Peter Rabbit. Grandfather Frog yawned and shook himself and yawned again and said, "Johnny Chuck probably meant just what he said, and I think I'll follow his example. It's getting too cold for an old fellow like me. I begin to feel it in my bones. I'm getting so sleepy that I guess the sooner I hunt up my bed in the mud at the bottom of Smiling Pool, the better. Chum! Johnny Chuck is wise. I'll see you in the spring, Peter Rabbit, and tell you all about it." And with that, Grandfather Frog dived with a great splash into the Smiling Pool. Chapter 20. Peter Tries Ol' Mistah Buzzard. Peter Rabbit sat on the edge of the Smiling Pool and stared at the place where Grandfather Frog had disappeared with a great splash. He watched the tiny waves spread out in rings that grew bigger and bigger and then finally disappeared too. Now what did Grandfather Frog mean when he said, "I'll see you in the spring, Peter Rabbit"? Johnny Chuck had said the very same thing as he had gone down the long hall of his snug house. Yet it would be a long, long time before spring, for it was not even winter yet. Where did they expect to be all winter, and what did they expect to do? The more Peter puzzled over it, the less he could understand it. "My head is whirling round and round, so many funny things I found. Folks say it grows too cold to stay, yet do not seem to go away. They talk of meeting in the spring, but don't explain a single thing. They just go into their houses and say goodbye. I don't understand it at all, said Peter Rabbit, staring at the big lily pad on which Grandfather Frog had sat all summer, watching for foolish green flies to come his way. Somehow the big lily pad made Peter Rabbit feel terribly lonely. Then he had a happy thought. "I'll just run over and ask old Mr. Buzzard what it means. He'll be sure to know," said Peter Rabbit, and off he started, lippity-lippity-lip, for the Green Forest. When Peter got where he could see the tall dead tree that old Mr. Buzzard had made his favorite resting place, he could see old Mr. Buzzard stretching his big wings as if getting ready to fly. Peter hurried faster. He didn't want Mr. Buzzard to go away before he could ask him what Johnny Chuck and Grandfather Frog had meant. Peter couldn't shout because he didn't have much of a voice, you know, and when he was out of breath anyway. So he just made those long legs of his go faster as they could, which is very fast indeed. Just as Peter Rabbit almost reached the tall dead tree, old Mr. Buzzard jumped off the branch that he had been sitting on, gave 2 or 3 flaps of his great wings, and then spread them out wide, began to sail round and round and round, up and up, as only Mr. Buzzard can. "Wait, wait, please wait!" panted Peter Rabbit, but his voice was so weak that old Mr. Buzzard didn't hear him. He saw Peter, however, but of course he didn't know that Peter wanted to talk to him. With a long swoop, old Mr. Buzzard sailed off right over Peter's head. "Goodbye, Brer Rabbit. I'll see you in the spring," said old Mr. Buzzard, and before Peter could say a word, he was out of hearing up in the sky. Peter watched him go up and up until he was just a speck in the blue, blue sky. Now what did he mean by that? Is he going to stay up in the sky until spring? Asked Peter Rabbit to himself, but not knowing, of course, he couldn't answer. So that's the end of our session this time, boys and girls. Peter Rabbit really doesn't understand when his friends are saying, "I'll see you in the spring." Tune in next time to see if he figures out what's going on. See you soon.